Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 10, Part A. The grave of Isaac Stringer in the cemetery of St. John's Cathedral, Winnipeg, bears this inscription: "In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils in the wilderness." And no words could more accurately describe the circumstances of a great part of his life and ministry. Even St. Paul, who first used the words of himself, could not have visualized the varied vicissitudes through which his northern successor would pass. To travel on foot through muskeg, swamp, and forest, by dog sled through snow and ice, by canoe along rock-strewn streams and fast-flowing rivers, and on horseback over rough trails, to say nothing of more orthodox journeys by road, rail, and ocean. And toward the end of his life, by air. All were part of the life and experience of Isaac Stringer. Sometimes he went alone, sometimes his wife accompanied him. Sometimes he had with him other clergy or lay workers as his traveling companions. Nor was the bishop the man to make circumstances easy for himself. Where there were people who looked to the church for ministrations, and there were many, he must be there to serve them. Where there was a missionary laboring in difficulty and isolation, the bishop would come as often as he could to cheer and encourage. Where economies could be effected by simplicity of travel, even at the expense of comfort, the bishop was a faithful trustee of the funds committed to his care. During the first 2 or 3 years of his episcopate, Stringer spent relatively little time in the diocese. In 1906 and 7, there had been his journey to England in search of financial support. In 1908, he was in England again for Lambeth Conference. On his return, he spent the winter in Ontario with his family. During that time, he was engaged in services and meetings, enlisting aid for the northern missions. And for some weeks, he was the victim of colds and influenza. The spring of 1909 saw him with the added burden of the care of the Mackenzie River Diocese. Bishop Reeve had retired in 1907, and the see remained vacant until the consecration of Bishop Lucas in 1913. In the interim, Bishop Stringer was asked to undertake the episcopal visitation, which nearly cost him his life. For the summer of 1909, he decided upon a plan which would take him first to the Yukon for a brief visit to the diocese, and then back to Vancouver and Edmonton. From Edmonton, he would go down the Mackenzie to the northernmost missions, across the mountains to Fort Yukon, and back to his home in Dawson. He arrived at Edmonton on June 1st, and left for the north by stage on the following morning. 3 weeks later, he reached Fort Chipewyan, where he confirmed 6 boys and girls, and ordained Orlando James Roberts, the resident missionary, to the priesthood. On arriving at Smith's Landing, he was surprised to find how much the settlement had grown. There were now about 30 houses, and he called at as many of them as he could, including the police barracks, after which he left for Fort Smith in a cart. The first part of the road was muddy and in places under water, so that the 16-mile journey took 3 hours. At Fort Smith, he looked over the land and made recommendations for the location of the mission. The next stage of the bishop's journey was taken in the steamer Mackenzie River, a new and well-built vessel. Combination river and lake boat, roomy cabins and dining cabin, but berths only 5 feet 10 inches long. Rather short for a 6-footer like myself, said the bishop. The steamer stopped briefly at Fort Resolution, and the bishop went ashore to find that most of the 700 Indians and the 50 of mixed race belonged to the Church of Rome. His next stop was at Hay River, where he found C.E. Whitaker, who had served with him at Fort McPherson and Herschel Island. Also at the mission was A.J. Vale, whom he had ordained in Toronto, and who was now in charge of the Indian Residential School. He spent some time at the school, conferred with each of the staff members, and confirmed 20 candidates. All in all, he felt that there existed a very happy and satisfactory situation. Among those he met at this time was Charles F. Johnson, 25, the engineer at the school, who agreed to accompany him across the mountains to Dawson. Continuing the voyage, the steamer stopped at Fort Providence, where Bishop Stringer met Father Gros, whom he had encountered years before on his first visit with the Eskimos. A stop of nearly 24 hours enabled the bishop and Whitaker, who had accompanied him from Hay River, to visit many of the residents and to hold a service of Holy Communion in the church. At Fort Wrigley, the 3 or 4 Anglican families asked for a resident clergyman. Quote, "We reached Fort Norman at 11:30 p.m. and decided to celebrate the Holy Communion, which took place at midnight, conducted by Mr. Whitaker and myself, each holding a candle in our hands in order to read. I gave an address, about 55 present, 24 communicants. Afterwards had a talk with some of the Indians." Unquote. When the bishop left Fort Norman at 3 a.m., he took Henry Courtney Winch, the deacon in charge, with him. He had in mind the possibility of ordaining him to the priesthood for Fort McPherson. There were further stops at Fort Good Hope and Arctic Red River, which were almost exclusively Roman Catholic, and in the small hours of July 12th the steamer tied up at Fort McPherson. The arrival at Peel River was a momentous occasion for the bishop. Here he had come as a missionary recruit nearly 20 years before, and here he had brought his bride when returning from his first furlough. Most of the Indians and Eskimos were at the landing when the boat arrived, and all greeted the bishop gladly. Some of them were happy to see him because they had known him previously. Others welcomed him feeling they knew him because of all they had heard about him from their friends. The 10 days in Fort McPherson were busy ones. On the evening following their arrival, Henry Courtney Winch was ordained. Whitaker presented the candidate, and the bishop preached a simple, straightforward sermon on the texts, quote, "Then Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them, and there was great joy in that city." Unquote. The sermon dealt no doubt with the privileges of the preaching ministry and the responsibility of the newly ordained to carry on the tradition of Philip. Most of those present were Indians, and the Holy Communion was celebrated in Tuduk. On each of the following days there were services and interviews and conferences with Indians and Eskimos, for the bishop was never too busy to see them. There were letters to be written and future plans to be discussed. On the following Sunday, the Indian service in the afternoon was conducted by the bishop, Whitaker, and Edward Sittichinley, whom Bishop Reeve had ordered deacon 6 years previously. Bishop Stringer gave an address which was interpreted by his old friend and guide of former days, Paul Tizzle. There were about 140 people in church and 91 communicants. Then the bishop, Whitaker, and Johnson left Fort McPherson for Kittigazic and Herschel Island. They traveled in a whaleboat without any native help, and made a quick trip, reaching Kittigazic, as the Eskimos would have said, in 3 sleeps. The Eskimos were still asleep when the missionaries arrived, but soon all were awake and came down to meet the visitors, chattering and shaking hands. For the next week, Stringer and his colleagues visited all the families in the vicinity, inquiring after their spiritual and physical welfare, and at the same time taking a census for the Dominion government. There were 103 people there, and in between them they owned 14 whaleboats and a number of kayaks. Services were held frequently, and at one of these Whitaker spoke to the Eskimos on the subject of baptism. The missionaries had, he said, been speaking to them of the gospel of Jesus Christ all these years, and they felt that the time had now come when the Eskimos should be offered the opportunity and privilege of becoming members of the church, which is the body of Christ. A few days later, an open-air service was held in the shelter of a skin boat. It was a hearty but reverent service, and after Whitaker had spoken to the people, he united in marriage Jimmy Mimaguna and Shukiak. Quote, "They stood up in the wind, Mr. Whitaker wearing my roche and stole. He had no surplice. It was quite a matter-of-fact ceremony. Both understood what it meant. This is the first marriage performed at Kittigazic," unquote, the bishop noted. On the following day, further services were held, and when Whitaker had given an address, the bishop baptized Adulik, a cripple of the Kukpugnik tribe, to whom he gave the Christian name of John. The Eskimo, said the bishop, seemed clearly to understand the significance of the occasion. This was their first baptism after 17 years of missionary effort. The satisfaction and thankfulness of the missionaries can well be understood. At last their labors seemed to be bearing fruit. Later on the same day, another young Eskimo was baptized and took the name of Simon. From Kittigazic, the missionaries made their way along the coast to Herschel Island, and again they reached their destination quickly. Since Stringer's time, a detachment of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police had been established on the island, and now he was greeted not only by the Eskimos, but also by Police Inspector Jennings and his men who were living in the building which the Stringers had occupied as a mission house. Everything looked much the same, the bishop wrote in his diary. There were the same buildings and many of his old friends among the natives. In fact, everything seemed so much the same that he had a peculiar feeling of loneliness and detachment. One whaler, the Rosie H., called at Herschel Island while they were there. The frequent services were attended by both Eskimos and whites, and, as at Kizikazuk, addresses and instruction were given on the nature of baptism. Following the instruction, 6 Eskimos were baptized: James Atumukachin and Hannah Nashugalok, his wife, Thomas Ukmok, who was later ordained to the diaconate, and Susie Atugok, his wife, Charlie Kalagag, and Elias Tatuk. At the end of the day, the bishop wrote in his diary, quote, "A great satisfaction to see these 6 baptized. They all came forward of their own accord, and they all seemed in much earnest. This is practically the first fruits of all these years of work. Some children were baptized before, and a few special cases, like George and Wilfred, but this is practically the first adult baptism at Herschel Island. Very gratifying." Unquote. And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 10, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.